Welcome to the Interstitial Cystitis and Relationships webinar, sponsored by a grant from the Allergan Foundation. My name is Lee Lowry, and I'm the Executive Director of the Interstitial Cystitis Association. Thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, I'd like to share a little bit about the Interstitial Cystitis Association. Also known as ICA, we are the only nonprofit charitable organization dedicated solely to improving the quality of healthcare and lives of people living with interstitial cystitis. The ICA update is published 3 times per year, and it's a benefit for donors who give $50 or more annually. We also archive back issues on our website and provide access to the archives depending upon the annual donation level. Oops. ICA e-News is ICA's free biweekly electronic newsletter and currently has more than 45,000 subscribers. ICA's website has a wealth of free information and tools, including the ICA Healthcare Provider Registry and IC support group listings. The website receives more than 2.7 million page views a year from almost 800,000 users. Come visit us at www.ichealth.org. ICA's online support community, which is provided by Inspire, is a safe, peer-to-peer, moderated forum that currently connects more than 10,000 people experiencing similar symptoms, situations, and experiences. If you haven't already, check out ICA's social media channels, including Facebook and Twitter, to get support and discuss challenges of living with IC. We have more than 34,000 Facebook likes and reach more than 6 million people. Please note that this list of resources is available to download in the handout section of the webinar control panel. A couple of notes before we begin. Your phones will remain muted for the 60-minute duration of this webinar. If you have any questions, please type them in the questions box on the control panel, and we will try to address them at the end of the presentation. We are recording today's session, and we will send a link to the recording in an email to you in the next couple of days. Now, let's get started with an introduction of today's presenters. Tasha Casper has a master's in clinical psychology with emphasis on marriage and family therapy. She is dedicated to providing therapeutic and coaching services to individuals and their loved ones who are dealing with the emotional impact of chronic pain, illness, or cancer. Tasha has lived with IC for 13 years and is a triple-negative breast cancer survivor. She went to 5 urologists to get diagnosed. She was diagnosed with a cystoscopy. She's tried the typical medications, Almiron, Urel, etc., Interstim implant on left hip with leads to both sides of her bladder, years of trigger point injections and nerve blocks, hysterectomy and bladder hydrodistension, and Botoxed pelvic floor several times. She's currently still using the following: 2 to 3 times weekly bladder installations, pelvic floor physical therapy, medications, compounded suppositories, lidocaine gel, and she follows the IC diet. We also have Laura Santuri, who has a professional background in public health. She has a PhD in health promotion and a Master of Public Health with a focus on health promotion and disease prevention. Her primary area of interest is self-management of chronic disease, and she has lived with IC for 20 years. It took Laura visits to multiple providers and about 3 years to get a diagnosis. She was 15 years old when her symptoms began. She's tried a variety of treatments but currently relies on stress management for pain management. Thank you, Tasha and Laura, for joining us today. At this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, starting with Laura.
All right. Well, thank you to everyone who is on the webinar for joining us today. As Lee mentioned, this webinar is really all about living with IC and some of the issues that we can face when we're navigating relationships with others. So the purpose of this webinar is to discuss some of those issues, as well as some of the potential strategies that we can use to address those issues, and ultimately, hopefully have a more positive, fulfilling, and effective relationships with others. And we'll talk about these issues and strategies by the different types of relationships that we have with others. This isn't an all-inclusive list, but we will talk through relationships with ourselves, healthcare providers, partners and spouses, caregivers, family and children, friends and coworkers and colleagues. Next slide. So before we begin, what I'd like to do is just make sure that we briefly discuss what IC is, just in case there's anyone on the webinar today who is unfamiliar or a little less familiar with the condition. And what you see on the slide in front of you is the definition from the American Urological Association guidelines. And you can read that, but it's important to point out that IC can be quite different from patient to patient, but in general, the symptoms revolve around urinary pain, urgency, and frequency. And when you look at the research literature, when you talk to patients, and even in the most recent ICA survey, pain is definitely noted as one of the most problematic symptoms that can be highly disruptive to patients' lives. We also know that the disease is categorized currently into two different categories. We have folks who have something called a Hunner's ulcer, or a red bleeding area in the bladder wall. We call that the ulcerative type. And we also know that the majority of patients do not have these ulcers, about 90 to 95%. It's also important to note that IC is sometimes referred to by other names, and you can see some of those on the slide here. Next slide. So in addition, while current estimates indicate that the condition is more prevalent or occurs more often in women than men, it is also important to note that this condition does not discriminate. So we know that anyone, regardless of sex, race, ethnicity, or age, can get IC. And more men than we think may have the condition, given issues with underdiagnosis or misdiagnosis. So we have a range of around 4 to 12 million people estimated to have IC in the US, with some literature showing even more than this, even more than 12 million. And unfortunately, we don't know what specifically causes IC, but there are a number of possibilities that are currently being explored through research. Next slide. So while we don't know the true cause of the condition, patients do have a variety of options with regard to treatment. The AUA has published guidelines on treatment, and this document breaks those treatment options down by those that should be tried first, then second, etc. And what you see on this slide are the first two lines of treatment. And first, and importantly, patients need to be educated on the condition and potential things that can make it worse, as well as how to engage in effective self-care and stress management. Second line options do include things like physical therapy, pain management, and there are a variety of oral medications and medications that can be instilled directly into the bladder that are available to IC patients. And I think this webinar addresses one of those key areas in first-line treatments, and that's self-care. Learning how to have more positive and effective relationships with others is a really important self-care strategy. So what I'm going to do now is turn things over to Tasha, who will be talking about one of the most important relationships that we have, and that's our relationship with ourselves.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Lee and Laura. Hello to everybody listening, and welcome. Today is our goal. We want to help you with your various relationships, and the most important relationship is the one with yourself. So how you treat yourself and what you think, believe, and say to yourself is the most important. And this usually starts well before you're diagnosed. You start thinking, what's wrong with me? So it's important that you constantly adjust your emotional story as well as the physical story. And what you tell yourself needs to be challenged. The most important relationship with yourself is the foundation for every other relationship, because you will see and interact with everybody through this lens of how you feel about yourself. So it's important to talk about this narrative and this story that you have and how you describe it to others. And this will impact your relationships, and there's also capacity to improve your symptoms and reduce pain. Next slide, please. So some of the potential challenges is I believe that chronic pain and illness challenges every single stitch of your being. And many of us may be living an inauthentic life in the sense that we're hiding the truth, we're pretending to be fine, and we're not really truthful about how we're feeling. And by hiding that, that just causes a tremendous amount of stress. Other options and issues that are very common are being depressed, feeling hopeless, loss of interest. This can also include mood swings and sleep problems. I refer to it as painsomnia, and also social withdrawal and isolation. Anxiety is also very common, and it may cause thoughts of excessive worry, racing thoughts, panic, racing heartbeat, and trembling, and this will increase your pain also. Another thing that is super common, and it's one that we want to address from the very beginning of your story, is not getting into the habit of catastrophizing. Catastrophizing is taking a situation and just having negative thoughts and beliefs about it, which make it worse. And we're not looking at it either in a neutral way or in a way that is just more realistic. So there's ways to deal with catastrophizing, and we'll get to those. And three things that I think a lot of people miss when they talk about chronic illness and chronic pain is the concept of grief and loss. Grieving how your life was before, the things you used to be able to do, the energy you used to have. Grieving the dreams you had for the future, how you thought things were going to be. And this is regardless of age, because we all have dreams and thoughts about the future. Feeling like your body has betrayed you and grieving their body from before. Feeling very stuck or feeling like you're missing out of things. And it's very common to cycle through the stages of grief, which include denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and acceptance. Judgment and shame can come from internal thoughts, but they often come and are initiated from people around us. One of my favorite is the, well, you look good comment. And I feel that that is a way of people dismissing and demeaning what's really going on with you. You may have said to somebody, hey, I'm not feeling well today, I'm really hurting. And the response will be, well, you look good, as if it's just not okay for you to feel how you're feeling, because they can't see your pain. And so there's ways to overcome that, and that may internalize judgment and shame to yourself. Another one that people do is, oh, well, if you would just do this, do X, Y, Z, eat less sugar, eat more sugar, whatever it is, exercise less, exercise more, whatever their opinion is, again, it's a way of just kind of dismissing how you're truly feeling. And that can chip away at your core and may decrease your sense of self-worth. And the last one is kind of the culmination of all of this, your self-image and your self-esteem. Are you feeling, sense of worthlessness or being a burden? You may not recognize yourself. You may have fear of rejection or become hypersensitive. And also minimizing because you don't want to have to explain how you're feeling all the time, or overcompensating, so you overdo it and you don't listen to your body. And the thing is the person who is the hardest on yourself is generally yourself. Your inner voice may say things to you that you would never say to another human being, and we need to work on that. Next slide, please. So you probably know all those things, and now how do we deal with it? How are ways that we can challenge this and go through it? And so effective strategies and proven strategies, a lot I'm sure you've heard, is cognitive behavioral therapy, which wants you to change how you're thinking, which means you're not going to put rose-colored glasses on or sugarcoat anything. And people may talk about talk therapy, but the typical response of somebody with chronic pain may say, oh, it's not imaginary, my pain is not in my head, and how is talking about it going to help me? Dr. Rostafinsky talks about it and saying, hey, all all pain is literally in your head. It's how we experience it. It is real pain that registers in your brain, and it is processed through the way you see the world. That does not mean that it is imaginary, but what it does mean is we can adjust it and work on ways to control it. Also, the CDC recommends therapy as the first line of treatment instead of opioids, and it is proven just as effective when you do all of the different things as pain medication. So cognitive behavioral therapy may include relaxation techniques, positive affirmations, creating a toolbox, which is a variety of these things that work for you so that you're prepared when a flare comes, mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is includes meditation, yoga, and other ways to reduce your stress, setting behavioral goals, and activity pacing. So you're not overdoing it and you're not underdoing it. You're pacing yourself so you don't have an activity hangover, for lack of a better word. And accepting your reality. You may not be good at what you used to do, but you're still very useful and you're still a wonderful human being. And so you just have to adjust and leverage it and apply it to something new. I have included 3 worksheets that are in the handouts that you guys can access afterwards. They're self-guided worksheets, and the 3 of them are the cycle of maladaptive symptoms, so how we function, and how to challenge automatic negative thoughts, so how you can start learning to change your thoughts, and how to decatastrophize your fears. So if you're feeling fearful about something, you can kind of walk through those worksheets. If you have any questions, you can reach out to us at any time. Next slide. And other ways to just be yourself and improve your self-esteem and improve your relationship with yourself is be authentic with yourself and with others. Learn ways to build resiliency. The human capacity has a fantastic ability to become resilient, and nobody is ready and self-prepared to deal with chronic pain and chronic illness. And so we have to learn new coping strategies in how to do this. And the good news is that we can do that, and there's plenty of resources. Be very gentle with yourself. Be kind to yourself. Keep that inner voice being nice and positive, or at least neutral if nothing else. Enjoy the good days and times, and don't apologize for them. If anybody gives you grief about having a good day and feeling good, just ignore it. You need to enjoy those times. And also, I believe there's no single answer, but it's a constantly evolving process and mixture of what works and what doesn't work. And what works today may not work in a year or 2 years from now, and vice versa. So you can constantly change and try things. And also practicing gratitude and positivity is a great way to kind of keep yourself in a good, realistic spot. And the last is just challenge everything. There is no status quo. Never lose hope. There's always new medicines, new treatments, new therapies, new exercises. Challenge your thoughts, challenge everything. And a quick example for me, with my work, I completely lost my self-identity when I became sick. I hid it from everybody. I was not living an authentic life, and I became depressed. My symptoms were terrible, and I just felt that everything was out of control. Eventually, my body just stopped, and it forced me to stop working, and I had to really take a look at this. I did work with my own therapist who specializes in chronic pain and illness, and I've done a lot of this stuff, and so I know it works and it helps. And I was so busy being like a human doing and caught up in the things that I do that I lost my self-value because I couldn't do them anymore. And it took me a while to remember that I'm a human being and I'm okay the way I am. Laura, do you have an example that you want to share with us?
I do. So I've definitely, as a person, focused on relaxation techniques, stress reduction, and goal setting. Those have really been kind of my primary strategies. And for me, it's kind of this balance between allowing myself to feel poorly, because sometimes that's just okay, but also making sure that I don't allow myself to stay there and to push myself to do things that maybe I never thought possible. And so for me, it was mentioned that my main strategy for managing pain, which is my primary symptom, is running, believe it or not. And back, I had a period of time where things were really, really bad, and I made a decision that I wanted to start running again because I knew that physical activity made me feel better. And so it was literally a process of, okay, next week I'm going to go out and I'm going to walk 2 times for 10 minutes. And then the week after it was, okay, I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to add an additional walk. And I've literally been action planning in that way for the past almost over a decade. And I've gotten to the place where, not that this is for everybody, but I did my first ultra marathon a few months ago. And for me, that's really kind of, again, it's that balance of feeling kind of, allowing myself to feel crummy when I need to, but also making sure that I lace up my shoes and get out there. All right, so why don't we'll go to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit about having a relationship with healthcare providers. This is a really important one. When living with a chronic condition, having positive and effective relationships with our healthcare team is really important, especially when this might mean working with multiple providers. So for example, when living with IC, it might be important for a patient to have a primary care provider, a urologist, a physical therapist, a pharmacist, and a mental health counselor as part of the treatment team. For me, I add my running coach into the mix. And there's a lot of discussion in the research literature around something called the chronic care model. And this is essentially a way of organizing the approach to working with patients who have chronic conditions. And an important element of this model includes having activated patients who feel empowered to engage in self-care and who feel like their providers are a partner in their care, as opposed to an authority who's just kind of there to tell them what to do. And so the relationship between the provider and the patient really should be collaborative in nature. And we know that if that collaborative partnership is followed, patients do better. Patients feel better. But we also know that there are barriers to positive and effective relationships with providers. For example, sometimes we have very limited time with the provider. In addition, sometimes the communication we might feel is lacking. Sometimes things aren't always clear. Misunderstandings can result. And in addition, if our providers don't communicate among each other in the team, this can really lead to some frustration and misunderstanding. Next slide, please. So, fortunately, as a patient, there are some things that we can do to address those potential challenges. And I've got 2 main strategies that I'd like to discuss here. The first one is preparing for a visit with a provider, and second, bringing an advocate to the visit. And really at the heart of each of these strategies is improving communication. So when a visit with a provider is nearing, it's really important to plan for it, to really reflect about it. And it's not just when it's your first visit with a provider, really any visit. And I think it's important to put that reflection and your plan down on paper. And I think there are 2 key aspects of a plan, and you see those on the slide. So first, what do I need my provider to know? So it's always the kind of standard things. It's really important for your provider to know what medications and supplements you're taking, if you have allergies, if you've had a prior surgery, relevant medical history. If you've tried a variety of other treatments, you want to make sure that you're able to articulate to your provider what you've tried and how they've worked. Another one that we don't often think of is around the issue of access. So if a provider has maybe prescribed a medication to you and you're having trouble affording it, that's another thing that's really important for you to convey to your provider. Second, on the flip side, is what do I need to know from my provider? And there's a number of examples here. So if you're going through a process of trying to figure out what something is, so a diagnostic process, so maybe you're having some tests and you're trying to come to a diagnosis, having an explanation of what those tests are, what they're, what is it going to be like for you step by step. If you're talking about treatment options, it's really important to get a really thorough description of the options that are available to you, including potential side effects. So when I'm putting together this plan, so what does my provider need to know from me, and what do I need to know from my provider, I actually have a Microsoft Word document for each of my providers, and I simply go in and update it each time I go in for a visit. So I'm not reinventing the wheel each time I'm using that same document. And I keep history and notes from my visits in that document as well. Another thing I want to point out as part of the planning process is maybe you go online and you Google something and you see maybe a new treatment or something new. I do recommend bringing a printout of that information that you found online that shows the source of the information, because the provider can review it with you and help you decipher first whether or not the source is reputable, but also whether or not it's relevant to you. Next slide, please. Another way to think about this is the use of this acronym TAKE PART. And this is really just kind of a reiteration of what I've just gone through, but the first part of this is prepare. And so documentation, as I mentioned, is a really key part of this. Keeping track is important. So maybe you're trying a new treatment and it's important for you to keep a voiding or a pain diary to keep track of your symptoms so that you can better reflect on whether or not that treatment is working for you. Reporting back, so making sure that you're letting your doctor know if your symptoms have changed, especially as a result of a treatment. List, just like what I just talked about, writing down your main concerns, any questions. Ask, make sure you ask those questions when you're in the visit. Repeat is a nice strategy, so repeating back key points that when you're in the visit with the provider, saying, so what I hear you saying is, just to make sure that you're on the same page with your provider. And taking action. So if barriers arise, make sure that you let your provider know. Or if you leave a visit maybe and you're a little confused about something that was told to you or you don't remember something, call back and ask. It's also really okay to ask for written instructions as well. Next slide, please. And finally, even when we plan well, it can really sometimes be very helpful to have someone else with us when we visit a provider. So visits with providers, even if it's not the first one, if you're not feeling well especially, they can be really stressful, they can be really overwhelming. And when it is, that makes it hard for us to communicate effectively, even when we've got a plan. So having someone with you who might be a little more removed from the situation, who can help you remember things that were said, maybe ask questions that you might not think of on the spot, and just in general be there to support you can be a really helpful thing. So an example of this from my life, a number of years ago, I was getting bladder installations, and I went in for a bladder installation, and they could not catheterize me because of a quote-unquote kink in my urethra. So the nurse went and got the urologist, who was not my normal urologist. He came in without a word with something that looked like a very thick metal pen, and he dilated my urethra, while the nurse held my hand and mouthed, "I'm sorry." It was a very painful experience, and so much so that I never went back to that office, and I never got a bladder installation again. But I do believe that if someone had been there with me, and I know if I had been there, vice versa, if I had been a flipped role and I was there as an advocate for someone, I would have stopped that process and asked some questions. And I have to believe that if I had someone there with me, I think that that visit would have gone very differently. How about you, Tasha? Do you have an example?
Oh, absolutely. So I don't always have an advocate to go with me. So one of the things that I've learned, and you just have to ask them, they usually approve it, is on my phone I will record the office meeting. And that way at least I get all the information and I can go back and listen to it and review it, make sure that I get it properly. And another thing that I do is I keep a pain diary. This was incredibly helpful, especially in the first few years. And there's some apps out there that track that for you, and they can track your personal patterns, kind of what causes flares, and then you can put in what works, so what decreases your flares, or what didn't work. Let's say you tried something, you tried an installation and it didn't help, it made things worse. You can put that in there and you can track these things. And you can also track your mood. And then most of these apps will spit out a report, and you can take that to your doctor. And I think it's helpful because when you're in the I'm not feeling good days, it's very easy to forget like what you did, what you didn't do, what medications. And this way, kind of, I would do it at the end of the month. I would just, look at the chart and say, okay, what What do I need to adjust? What worked? What didn't work? What do I want to try? And I would use that and use that as a springboard to talk with my providers. So now we're going to move on to another very important relationship, and this is a relationship with your partner and or spouse. We have separated caregivers because your caregiver is not always your partner and spouse. And the discussion around partner and spouse, we want to address communication and intimacy and sexual issues. So the first is communication issues. Is usually becomes a big problem within a relationship, and that can decrease the emotional connection, increase arguments. You become more distant from each other. Things like financial strain, lack of work, can also put tremendous amount of stress and cause arguments and communication breakdown, and feeling overwhelmed. And I'm not talking about you feeling overwhelmed, we know that, but talking about your partner or your spouse feeling overwhelmed. They may have to, take on additional work or deal with the bills or deal with all of it, and they're suffering from your pain and illness, but just in a different way. They see you, they can't help you, they can't fix it, and so that causes them stress. And often they have added responsibilities. They may have to do more laundry, more chores around the house, take care of pets or children. So it stresses them, which then stresses the relationship. So ways to overcome that is to really communicate clearly. And active listening is a big part of that, repeating what you said and what they've said. Sitting down and just reviewing expectations of each other, and reducing the expectations of, do the dishes really need to be done tonight? Maybe not. Maybe they can wait until tomorrow. And also creating new roles. And if there's a way to kind of rotate roles so that no one person, neither you nor your spouse, gets burnt out on that, that is a good option to do. And also setting boundaries. Setting boundaries for yourself, setting boundaries for yourself as a couple, and saying, hey, this is time for us. We're going to carve out time for us. And even if you're not feeling well, maybe you just sit and cuddle and watch a movie. But setting boundaries is a big one. And also within the relationship, you can set boundaries of saying, okay, well, when I feel good, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. And when I'm not feeling good, here's my plan, here's my toolkit, these are the things that I'm going to do to help myself, but I really need you to step up here, and I need you to help me with this and this and this. So clearly communicating the expectations and setting boundaries is very helpful. Next slide, please. And now the big one. Most everybody with chronic pain and illness has problems with intimacy and sexual issues. And based on the people who responded and answered to the ICA webinar registration, a lot of you put that this is a big problem. And I have dealt with it personally, and we'll get to that. But so common issues, right? Reduced libido. You're just not in the mood. And if you do get in the mood or you do try, it's painful or it causes a flare. There's also medication side effects, can cause different blood flow or hormonal issues. And also your self-image. When you don't feel good, you don't feel like you look good, you certainly generally don't feel sexy. And so this kind of relates back to that very first relationship, right? The relationship with yourself, your self-esteem, and thinking, okay, I'm good and I'm wonderful just the way I am right now. You're not perfect and you're not the way you used to be, but you're still incredibly valuable and incredibly useful. And generally, your partner still finds you very sexy, even if you may not think so. So some things that you can do to increase the connection, right? And so first of all is understanding that intimacy is a separate act than sex. Often they go hand in hand, but you can be very intimate even if you can't have sex. And you can contain that, that connection within intimacy. You don't have to lose the intimacy part, even if you do lose the sexual component temporarily or for parts of time. So the intimacy is the emotional connection that makes us feel desired and loved. And same for your partner. It makes them feel desired and loved. And it is important to keep that emotional connection. Ways that you can do that is take time every day to at least kiss each other, touch each other, hug, massage. You know, maybe it's massaging your feet or your hands or your back, whatever feels good. And there's studies that show if you have an empathetic partner that is translated through touch. So if you think about the example of women in labor and giving childbirth, if their partner is there and kind of holds their arm or touches them or rubs their back, they can convey their feeling and their love and their empathy through that touch. So it's important to just remember to touch and kiss and you know, massage each other. That is a way to keep intimacy. Another one is to be creative and be open. So sexually, right? You may have to rethink how you're doing things, and it may be very different. So things like self-stimulation, oral sex, trying different positions, using bolsters to support you in different positions, vibrators, trying different lubricants, talking sexy or sharing your fantasies, or having your partner share their fantasies with you, and even role-playing, etc. Be open. Try everything. You know, this is a toy nobody wants to break. We all want to feel loved, connected. We all want to feel sexy. And intimacy and sex is a fantastic part of the human experience, and we don't want to lose that. So it may look different than how you used to do it, but be open and try new things. Also, with your partner, you can create new rituals. You can, you know, set the scene, put out candles, special blankets. Maybe if you're not having sex, right, you can read romantic books together, take baths together, set time aside for the intimacy. And I say schedule it and stick to it, even if in the beginning you really don't feel like doing it. You may not be in the mood, but there's ways to try to get in the mood to at least have the intimacy part there and connect with your partner during that time, even without sex. This will help you both feel better. And if you can have sex, actually having an orgasm will bring blood flow to the pelvic area, and that often reduces symptoms. Connecting on the emotional level, sharing your dreams, your aspirations, talking about fun memories, laughing. These are all important parts to having that intimate connection. And positive affirmations, right, about yourself and about your spouse. This helps to keep your self-esteem positive, helps you feel sexy, find the humor in it, okay? Even if you don't feel sexy at the moment, maybe there's something funny that happens and you can laugh about it and connect and say, you know, I'm sexy anyways. I'm sexy the way I am. And accept your body for everything that it can do. In these moments, don't focus on what it can't do. Focus on what it can do. If you have medications that are giving you side effects as far as like blood flows or hormonal issues, you can talk to your doctor. You can schedule your intimate times so that maybe you stretch out that medication, or maybe you skip a dose. Again, talk to your doctor so that you can have an intimate time. And, you know, and then one of the last two things is to try new treatments. Right? There's always new stuff coming out, and that helps you to not lose hope. I will explain two treatments. One of them is called the O shot, and it takes blood out of you, and then they spin it and take the proteins out of it and all the good stuff out of it, and then they re-inject it into you in the vaginal area around the clitoris, and it is supposed to help with orgasm. And the other one is called the Mona Lisa, and it's a non-hormonal laser vaginal rejuvenation. So often women, as you age, and definitely when you have chronic pain and illness in the pelvic area, the vaginal walls can become very thin. There may not be hormones, and that's what makes sex painful. And so this laser treatment is very not painful. It sounds painful, but it's not very painful. It's a 5-minute procedure in your urogynecologist's office. They numb you up with cream. They put the laser. It's 5 minutes, and you go home. It feels like a bad sunburn for a couple of days. You do a treatment of 3 5-minute lasers 6 weeks apart, and then after that, you do it once a year for maintenance. My testimony is I just did this as a cancer patient. Chemo annihilated everything that was left of any sexual part of me. I could not orgasm, which was not an issue prior to cancer, but I did have tremendously painful sex, and it became impossible to have sex, absolutely impossible. And so I recently went through the Mona Lisa, figured I'd give it a go, right? And I am happy to report that my pain during sexual intercourse has reduced at least 50%. And I am very happy with the results. It's also helped with stress incontinence, and it has also increased my ability to orgasm again, which, woohoo, I'm very happy to have that back. So I encourage you guys to check this out and, get your sexy on. Laura, how about you? How's your relationship with your husband?
Well, I have to say, I think there's about 100 people on the call, and there might be 100 of us who run out and ask our doctors about Mona Lisa.
I do it.
Yeah. So for, like many of you, pain with sexual intimacy is probably my biggest, most consistent, most problematic symptom. And it's been a real problem. It's had some really serious disruptive consequences in my life. And in fact, my first marriage, I really wasn't able to have what you would consider traditional sexual intercourse. And ultimately, my then husband actually chose to seek physical intimacy elsewhere. And that really ended that marriage. So my current husband, not that my issues were an excuse for my husband's behavior, but I also knew that I needed to be a little more open and more willing to communicate with my husband about my pain and what was going on, knowing that my husband can't read my mind and that I need to actually give him the opportunity to be understanding in the process. And so I've really gotten over being scared to say things or shy about things. We're much more open. We communicate through the entire process. And that openness, that emotional intimacy, has really actually enhanced physical intimacy for us. So it's just, for me, really been about drawing really clear boundaries around, I need to tell him if something hurts. If I need to stop, we need to stop. And that open communication has made a really positive difference in our relationship. So what we'd like to do now is talk kind of briefly about caregivers. We mentioned that we separated this out, and you can see some facts on this slide from the National Alliance on Caregiving and AARP. And it's interesting to note that there are a lot of people who are caregivers in the U.S. Majority of them are caring for a relative. On average, this is a little bit like a part-time job. And we know that not only do caregivers themselves have their own health issues, but there also can be health consequences from being a caregiver. And I certainly don't bring that up to make anyone feel poorly about it, but I think it's helpful for us to acknowledge this, especially if we're hoping to have positive and healthy relationships with those who might be providing care to us, whether that's maybe only during flare-ups, fairly minimal, or it could be care that's provided on a more regular basis. Next slide, please. So the strategy that I want to talk about here, one I think we've all heard of, but it never hurts to get a refresher, is this idea of active listening. And it's pretty straightforward, but again, sometimes we need a reminder to really pay attention to people when they're talking to us. And this really goes with having those conversations with caregivers, is really listening to them without thinking about the next thing that we want to say. Withholding judgment in that process, which could be a bit of a challenge, but at least catching yourself when you start to have judgmental thoughts and kind of put those aside for a moment. Reflecting, so this is a little bit like repeating back, as I mentioned before when I was talking about communicating with healthcare providers. Clarifying or asking questions, and at the end of a conversation, summarizing what you've heard to make sure that you really understood what they told you, and that gives them an opportunity to correct or add something to it. And of course, sharing is also a part of active listening as well. So you get to share and participate in the conversation as well. And so for me, kind of an example of this, I was writing this slide a couple of weeks ago, realizing that, okay, the night before I was feeling pretty poorly, and I went to bed early with a heating pad, and I left my husband to take care of our 6 dogs and feed them and medicate them and get them out before we went to bed. And it was the next morning, and I'm writing this slide, and I'm thinking, I really appreciate that he did that, and I want to make sure that I talk to him too. And he's recently had some more significant diagnoses in his life. So actually, as I was writing the slide, I got up and went into the room that he was in and sat down and just said, "Hey, how are you doing?" And, we had a nice conversation. So I know this stuff, but sometimes I need to be reminded of it. So how about you, Tasha?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think that my husband happens to be my primary caregiver, and so the one thing that we do is we have backup plans. So I try to enlist, kids, local neighbors, family, friends, as backup, so that if and when he has gotten sick, I can kind of lean on them a little bit. And then the other thing that I do is we plan usually a couple of times a year for him to go on a guys' weekend, and just not have to worry about me and just be able to relax. And we enlist one of the other caretakers, and that seems to work. It gives him the break that he needs to refresh and renew. So that's an important thing. So we're going to move on, and in the essence of time, we're going to move a little quickly through these last couple of ones, I think. So relationships with your family and children, right? This is very important. Most of us have family and children around us, and have to balance, familial and even parental roles. Some of you probably even have young children at home, and that can make it even more challenging. You may be fatigued, feel like you're not being there. Kids may not understand, why is mommy sleeping on the couch? Or you can have feelings of guilt, right? Like, I missed my kids' play because I had a flare, or whatever. And also, if you're not missing out on things, you can have fear of missing out on things, right? So of the future, right? So you missed out on something today, and then that causes fear for the future. So this can also put on, just familial strain. Everybody is strained. So that's, everybody gets their piece of the pie when it comes to chronic illness and pain. So don't think it's just you. Kids, if they're young kids, they may have to do increased chores and increased things, which can cause them to be, parentified or take on responsibilities that, normal kids that age shouldn't have to. So be mindful of that. And also, lack of understanding. Most people don't get it. We barely even get it, and we're living with the pain. So a good way that I like to explain to people, right, is to say, imagine having a rock in your shoe, right? It may not even be super painful, but boy, is it annoying, and you really want it out there. So, or even a penny in your shoe, and you can have anybody do this and say, walk around with that in your shoe all day long, but you can't take it out. Now, obviously, they're going to be frustrated. They want it out. It's painful. And then you can say, okay, times that by a week, by a month, by years. And that seems to drive that home, that point home. And then the last one, right, is jealousy. Different family members may become jealous of other family members. Maybe you made it to one person's event and was able to spend time with them, and then the next weekend you're down and out and you miss an event with somebody else. And so jealousy can become an issue. Next slide, please. So how do we avoid these things? So, next slide. Okay, thanks. And the way to avoid them, right, is so try to be mindful. And being mindful just means be in the immediate moment. Don't be in yesterday and don't be in the future. Try to enjoy the immediate moment. I suggest having family meetings and give everybody an update on your health at the same time, and also solicit their feedback. Have it to be an open discussion. Communicate as a team and set family goals. Also, again, setting boundaries and clear expectations for everybody is always very helpful. Rotating the responsibilities on a weekly or monthly basis helps, especially if you have kids at home or other family members that are living with you. It's like, you know, nobody gets stuck taking the trash out forever. It's like they only get it for a week or a month, and then somebody else gets a turn at it. And acknowledge the reality of, you know what, you didn't ask for this pain and illness. They didn't ask for it. It's not fun. Nobody likes it. So let's just acknowledge this elephant in the room and say, we don't like it, but how are we going to cope? How are we going to work together? Because we have to deal with this. And then also plan time for happy and positive events. You've got to schedule those in and not just feel like, oh, everything's been taken. For me, my example with my family is when I first got diagnosed, I was in terrible shape. I was working full time. I would hide under my desk at breaks to try to take a nap. And on my lunch break, I would do that. And then I would come home and I would just be fatigued and exhausted from working, you know, a 10-hour day or so. And I had no energy for my kids. I was sleeping on the couch. And they didn't understand. And so we started to sing. I was feeling guilty. I was feeling like a burden, like I was a terrible mom. And so one of the things we started was when we would all get home or whatever, we would do a check-in and we do what's called a heads up. Like, heads up, I had a really stressful, painful day and I'm not feeling well. And I would explain it to them and then we could adjust. And I also gave them the same opportunity because kids have stressful, crazy days, and so do our partners. So giving a heads up and just letting people know instead of trying to pretend or just being quiet about it, I think is very helpful. And take advantage of the good days. I eventually switched jobs and changed my career, but take advantage of the good days and the good times. Laura, how about you?
So I actually don't have two-legged children. I have four-legged children. I think you probably heard me mention that I have 6 dogs. So my immediate family is really my husband and my dogs, and I will just simply say that I highly recommend dogs as a therapy. I probably should have mentioned them as one of my stress management strategies because they're always very willing to cuddle up with me when I've had a bad day and don't really want to do anything else. So that's my plug for go get a dog. So let's move on, and I think I'm going to go through this relatively briefly, but we'll talk a little bit about relationships with friends. And I think a number of you noted this in your RSVP for the webinar, that there are some challenges with relationships with friends, especially when you have what we call an invisible illness. So, well, you look good, right? And so we know that there might be some misunderstandings if friends really don't understand what it's like to live with the condition. We know that going out can be a challenge. You know, when you've got symptoms that are relatively unpredictable, you need to be close to a restroom, you may have some dietary restrictions. Social outings can really be a challenge. And we know sometimes that we have to cancel or say no. We don't usually like to do that. We know that people sometimes don't know how to act around people who are ill or who have chronic pain, and that can cause problems. Sometimes that causes people to withdraw, even if that's not their intent. And sometimes there's a worry that even if we share our experience so that friends understand, We don't want to be a burden to other people. So next slide. Some basic strategies to think through this. I'll highlight just really a couple here. Of course, being willing to educate and answer questions and be open. And as part of that, be really clear about your limits. I do think being able to say no is nothing to be ashamed of. And in fact, I think it's an art and a skill that we can use in every aspect of our life. In addition, I say try not to take things personally. I think it's important to remember that people are generally well-intentioned, even when they act in ways that we would call unskillful. Support groups are an excellent resource to reach out to people who have similar experiences. And really, I think it's a quality over quantity issue, that sometimes you have to know that sometimes you have to let friendships go or relationships go that are no longer healthy or may have become toxic. And so for me, it's really key that I have really actually kind of a close circle of friends, one of whom I know that I can say absolutely anything, and she can say the same things to me. And so that's really been helpful for me, is really having that close relationship with someone else who really kind of understands. How about you, Tasha?
So yeah, right, friends, some will disappoint you and some will surprise you. I've been hurt and surprised. Some people who I thought were really great friends just basically disappeared, and others like super stepped up. So it's just kind of like go with the flow. Make sure you're keeping positive people around you that are not adding drama or toxicity to your life, I think would be the biggest thing. And, you know, if they disappear, don't take it personally. It's generally their issues that they can't handle it and not yours. So now, next slide, please. We're going to move to relationship with work and colleagues. So common issues, we're going to move through this quickly, is trying to hide the illness, trying to be perfect or overcompensating by overdoing it, spending extra time, fatigue and problems with stamina. You may have lose your job. You may have not enough hours and have a decline in income. So that can cause financial stress. Stigma, judgment, fear, and shame are unfortunately alive and well in the workplace, which is why a lot of people try to hide their illness and hide their symptoms. So dealing with those is very important. You may lose your job, or you may even go on disability. And another frustrating thing is using all your vacation time and money for your illness. Next slide, please. So the next things, right, strategies that you can do is, first of all, know your rights, right? So Americans with Disabilities Act affords you a lot of leeway. You do not have to disclose to your employer and coworkers unless you're asking for reasonable accommodations. And at that, then you only have to disclose your illness to your employer. You are never obligated to disclose to coworkers. Learn ways to manage your stress. Time-based pacing at work is very helpful. So say, okay, I'm going to work for a half an hour, and then I'm going to get up and go for a 5-minute walk, and then repeat that, or whatever your pace is that you can tolerate so that you don't overdo it. Dealing with unsolicited advice, right? Like all the, worker know-it-alls. The best way to do it is just to diffuse them and say, hey, I'm following a plan and a protocol that I've worked with my healing team and with my doctors, and I'm just going to stick to that. But thank you for your information, right? And then move on. And then at the end of it, consider a job or career change if you really can't do the physicality of what your current work is. Next slide. So as far as disability, that happened to me. I had to go on disability. It's not fun. It's not easy. It went about 2 years before I got any income at all. Thankfully, I was able to withstand that. But I will say that the ICA disability packet and the letters they have in there was incredibly helpful for me and through the process, and helped my doctors provide the proper information to disability, and I eventually got approved. They will almost always deny you at first go, but you have to appeal, and then IC is now listed on approved disabilities. And be prepared for the long process, but they also offer retraining programs and a return to work program. So, Laura, do you have any comments on that?
I know we're close to time, but I will just simply say that I've been fairly fortunate in the work environment, but I choose to disclose very carefully. I've never felt like I had to, and really only with people with whom I feel really safe in the work environment. I think we're at time, so I might turn things over to Lee.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you both to Laura and to Tasha for a great session. We did run out of time, and we won't be able to move into the Q&A section, but we do have the ability to answer the questions that have been asked through the portal. We will answer them in our follow-up email that will be shared with you either late this week or early next week as a follow-up. And so we will, as I mentioned in the beginning, we have recorded the session. We will include a link to that. I think we'll probably include a link to these handouts as well as answering the questions for you all. So once again, thank you so much to Laura and to Tasha, and thanks to all of you for dialing in and listening. And we hope that you learned some new things today that you can take back with you as you continue on your journey. Thank you. Bye-bye.